Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to host this event on city climate adaptation. And in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. But I wanted to say a word about the format and about the Climate Solution Lab, which is co-hosting tonight. That is part of Watson Institute's effort here at Brown University to kind of up our game on climate change. And we have a brand new report out for the next president of the United States with 10 executive orders that he could take on climate change without any help from Congress, which is something he might need in the next few months. But the format for tonight's session is that I'm going to open by asking 5 or 6 questions, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from the crowd. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Boston Mayor Marty Walsh to join us tonight. And as I understand, he just today became the chair of Climate Mayors, a vast organization of cities around the country committed to showing that we're doing something on climate change in this country in the wake of the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. So thank you so much, Mayor Walsh, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for having me. I want to thank obviously Brown University as well. I want to thank all of the folks on the call tonight, on the meeting tonight. I don't know if the call is a call or a meeting anymore. I think it's a meeting or a webinar or what have you. Certainly, what I'm about to say is not earth shattering. Climate change is the defining challenge of our time. We all know that. We've put a very major focus here in Boston on about what's going on with climate resiliency. And I think that we're all about to see a renewed national focus on climate action, which I'm very excited about. We've heard now the president-elect in 3 or 4 speeches reference climate as one of the pillars that he is working on, him in the Biden-Harris administration. So we're excited about that. I'm happy to talk to a lot of you on the call tonight about the work that we're doing in Boston and what I think we need to focus nationally, obviously. And I also just want to say today, I was the Climate Mayors was created when Donald Trump became the president. One of his first actions was to pull us out of the Paris Accord. I think we're one of 3 countries in the world. I forget the other 2 countries. I think I forget who they are. Whoever they are, they're friends of his, I suppose. And we started an organization, myself, Mayor Garcetti in LA, and a couple other mayors, and we started with a half a dozen mayors, and now we have 480 plus mayors from 48 states around the country. And we've been working really hard on laying down a foundation that I think that the Biden-Harris administration will be able to build upon on the work that we did under the Obama administration. So I'm excited. I'm also joined tonight by Chris Cook, Chief Environment for the City of Boston, that is here as well. So if I don't answer the questions exactly the way that all of the climate champions on this call do, Chris will cover me and take care of it. But I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm honored.
Well, great. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to start by asking you if you could just tell us a little bit about what you see as sort of the most daunting climate challenges that Boston faces and how you're helping Boston prepare for those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Boston is a coastal city. So like Providence, we're on the front line, obviously. The impacts of sea level rise is intensifying with storms. Back before I was the mayor in 2012, Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy made it clear to everyone that climate action must be an urgent priority. And certainly for me, as at the time I was a state representative, I looked at what New York felt, the full force of the devastation. I went down to Battery Park, and I was, as I was mayor, talking about the massive recovery effort that needed to happen down there. Thought about how lucky Boston was to miss that storm. It could have been much worse in the city of Boston. If Hurricane Sandy had been 6 hours earlier during the high tide, it would have been catastrophic. And we won't always be that early. I also, when I became the mayor, when the hurricanes and the floods happened in Houston, that really made me really think about where we are as a city and are we really prepared for the potentially inevitability of seeing sea level rise. And in the years here since then, we've seen historic high tides and floods. Just today in Boston, we got a king tide, which is causing significant flooding in Dorchester, a neighborhood where I grew up in. Anyone who's not familiar with Dorchester, it's right where the Kennedy Library is. It's at the campus of UMass Boston. That road often gets shut down. We're thinking big and fast as our work towards coastal resilient efforts. So we're working on that. No, just a side note, we're also concerned about the heat. We've experienced historic heat waves in recent years, which pose a significant threat to the risk of many of our residents. Just this last week alone, we're in the 70s most of the weeks. When you think about that, it's November. It's not supposed to be 70. It's 70. People are walking around with shorts and short sleeves, and that's not really what we should be doing. What we're doing in Boston to meet the challenge, we're focused on addressing the causes of climate change with major carbon reduction programs. We've remained committed in the city to the goals of the Paris Climate Accord, and we've certainly committed to becoming totally carbon neutral by 2050. We also focused on protecting people from the impacts of climate change. We have a neighborhood by neighborhood climate ready preparedness program called Climate Ready Boston, where we're literally going into different neighborhoods to talk about different impacts of sea level rise. We also have a broader vision for the coastal resilience called Resilient Boston Harbor. And anyone who's been to Boston, you see that our city is right on the water. And what we want to do is strengthen our coastline efforts with a series of parks and green space that absorbs floods when storms hit, and to improve the quality of life all year round. It also will help us mitigate, obviously, heat. We're looking at cost-benefit analysis right now. The clear choice is that we need to invest right now. Right now in the water, where two main flood pathways meet in South Boston, we've invested. We could invest $1 billion, or we could pay $19 billion in damages if the storm were to hit. The 4-point channel and the Dorchester Bay meet and flood. So this is no brainer when you think about making investments of $1 billion now to save, obviously 19 billion of federal mitigation. I just want to bring up two quick examples that we're looking at. Last summer, we celebrated a grand opening of a waterfront park close to downtown. The name of the park is Martin Richard Park. It was named after the youngest victim of the Boston Marathon bombing. It's a testament to Boston's spirit in the wake of the tragedy. I would suggest that if you Google it, you'll see Martin's Park as a gold standard of resiliency. It's absorbent. It's ready for high rising tide. So when you look at it, you'll see like berms and a little bit of hills there. It's fully accessible for our kids, and meaning that all kids of all abilities can play together, and there's no signs about that. But what it means is when we talk about protecting our city while connecting people to the waterfront, we just created this incredible, beautiful park for our kids while also protecting the South Boston waterfront, and so a section of the South Boston waterfront. We're going to continue right down the 4-point channel area. Those are not familiar with Boston, if you Google it, you'll see. Another example is Moakley Park. It's one of our most beloved open spaces here in the city. It's in South Boston. On one side of it is the ocean. On the other side is two sides of it, two public housing developments, the Mary Ellen McCormick and the Old Colony development. And for generations, people have come to this area to enjoy the outdoor space. What this does, it allows us, it's a major gateway right now to flood pathways that run into our residential neighborhoods. So it's not just the housing developments, it's also parts of South End, parts of Chinatown, parts of Roxbury, parts of Dorchester. And science is telling us by 2070, it would be underwater with a major storm. So we're looking at this opportunity, amazing opportunity to make investments of where we can achieve our climate planning, but it's also about prioritizing resiliency. At the end of the day, there's a lot of benefits to this. Equity is another example of this, but this is all part of our plan as we move forward here. So that's some of the, and we're also planting trees and parks and green spaces and heat islands. We're doing all of that stuff here in the city.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. I just want to, I'm going to ask another couple of questions, but I wanted to let our audience know that the floor is now open. We're going to collect some questions. If you're interested, use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen so you can enter in some questions, and I'll be happy to take some and relay them to the mayor. So, Mr. Mayor, I wonder whether you could say a little bit about what other cities like Providence can learn from Boston's experience so far adapting to climate change.
Well, I think it's really important that we have to be bold about this. We have to think outside the box, but it's also important that we work together on this, because it's not just simply Boston in a silo. It's the surrounding cities and towns up and down the coast, and Providence obviously is our neighbor to the south. We're already changing the conversations. Instead of looking at sustainability as a series of restrictions and compromises, we need to look at it as major opportunities. It's certainly an unprecedented opportunity to create green jobs, improve our public community spaces, develop game-changing innovations. Mayor Lorzo is part of the U.S. Climate Mayor, so when we have these meetings, we do talk about how do we move forward. And other mayors in Rhode Island, in not just Providence, but throughout Rhode Island and down to Connecticut and down, New York and all the mayors. We need to pursue climate solutions that have multi-benefited, like green jobs and improving quality of life. Cities, quite honestly, regardless of what the national government does, cities have long led on climate action, and clearly over the last 4 years. But we need to continue to work together through climate mayors and other organizations, because it's so important that we work collectively together. Whatever policy comes out of Washington, D.C., it's going to be carried out on a city level. It's going to be carried out on a town level. So cities need to keep leading in this work and supporting one another. And also, there's a great, exciting opportunity here through climate mayors and having an administration in Washington that believes in science, quite honestly.
Yeah, terrific. So I'm seeing some questions come in now, which is great. Let me just ask one more, and then I'll start calling on folks. How have you seen, Mr. Mayor, the coalition supporting climate adaptation grow and change over time?
To be honest with you, I think that it's becoming increasingly clear that the change impacts everyone. If we want a strong economy, we need to address climate change. If we want healthy populations, we need to address climate change. If we want, this is not a partisan issue. This is not Democrats versus Republicans, conservatives versus liberals, although it seems to be turning into that, and it shouldn't be. The issue of climate change and climate resiliency affects everyone. We need to keep bringing more people from more walks of life into these conversations, families and students and business community. And I think in some cases we have to explain and teach people where we are. We had a climate rally, if you will, at City Hall Plaza with kids that walk out of school. I think we had 10,000 young people on the plaza. And when the young people are talking, we need to listen. So it's important for us to have broad support, so we can generate more of these efforts and do more. The more, not necessarily broad support, but the more interest, the more education, the more successful we'll be.
Great. So I would love to call in one of our students, Gabby Rogers, who has a question for you. And I'm going to have to ask one of the tech folks to make sure that she gets in.
Hi.
Hi, Gabby.
I wanted to say congratulations, first of all. And the work that Boston has been doing on climate resiliency is very impressive. But I wonder, how do you plan for equity? Boston has a large racial wealth gap. How do you protect communities of color from climate gentrification?
Great question, Gabby. Thank you very much. What year are you in, Gabby?
I am an MPA student, so I'll be graduating in May.
Oh, good for you. Well, congratulations. Thank you for that. Certainly, I'll just talk for Boston. We know that people of color and immigrants and non-English speakers are at the greatest risk from climate impacts like heat waves, sea level rise, and all of that. If we look at a map, we're in that now, either whether in Boston or in the country, where extreme heat is the most severe in Boston, then we look at a map where people of color live. The map looks very similar. So as we think about this and we think about the work we're doing, and Chris can jump into a little more in the work that he's done. If you look at a map that's projected flooding in Boston, and then you look at a map where people of color live, the map looks similar. And I just mentioned we have two major housing developments right within a floodplain, if you will, in the city. And then when we talk about the South End into Roxbury, the majority of the folks that live in those neighborhoods are people of color. Also, climate climate action is not just an environmental issue, it's a public health issue, and it's a public safety issue, it's a human rights issue, and it's certainly a racial justice issue. It's part of the reason why in Boston we declared racism as a public health crisis in the city. We need to recognize the ways that historic systemic racism has profound and devastating impacts on people's health, well-being, and survival. Our long-term recovery here from COVID-19 has to be rooted in environmental and racial justice. There's no question about it. I'll give you an example. Carbon emission standards will focus on reducing emissions from our largest buildings and building career pathways for people of color. Green jobs is one of the biggest and fastest growing sectors in the coming years ahead. And we're going to make sure that our population most impacted by climate change benefits from these jobs. So there is a lot that we can do. And at this moment in time, I mean, obviously in the last 8 months here, 9 months here, when COVID first hit Boston back in February, March, April, May, June, March, April, May, beginning of May, we were focused on health inequities. And then when George Floyd was killed, systemic racism, which is here front and center in Boston, in this country, took a front page, and people protested and demonstrated and marched all across America. And when you looked at the signs, oftentimes there was signs in there about climate justice. So it wasn't just about policing. It was also about climate resiliency. It was about health disparities, about a whole bunch. So that's kind of what we're focused on right now in the city. I don't know if Chris, you want to jump in any more on that one.
The only thing I would add, Mayor, is that you recently appointed Dr. Carolyn Crockett as the Chief of Equity, and her job is to scan all of our policies. As the Mayor said, racism as a public health crisis is about housing, it's about jobs, it's about the climate. Climate change is about housing, it's about jobs, it's about socially vulnerable communities. So the Chief of Equity is really trying to find where those mental hitching posts and where those policy synergies are to make sure that we don't make the problem worse. Just very quickly on climate adaptation and gentrification, 2 things on that. One of the reasons the mayor identified Moakley Park and some of the other parks that we've taken early action on is because they are next to public housing, so they won't contribute to any gentrification or displacement. And these are people who can't leave in a climate crisis, so we have to protect them. There's a moral and ethical responsibility there. And then the last thing I would say is that we have to link it up to our housing policy so that as we make these great, beautiful recreational spaces, we are not contributing to displacement. And the mayor has produced more public housing during his tenure than at any other time in Boston's history.
It's great to hear what you're doing on this issue. And I'm teaching a course on politics of climate change this semester. And one of the things we're really focusing on is the way that climate change has different impacts on different groups of people, and especially how, unfortunately, it's going to hit minorities harder than white affluent Americans in particular. And so getting those different perspectives is going to be so important, not just for cities, but for all areas of the country.
Jeff, I just real quickly, I just want to touch upon this. With Chris, before Chris was the head of the chief of environment in the city, he was the head of the parks department in the city. And one of the things that we wanted to do was, at that point, there had been no cities in America that could brag and boast that they were within 10-minute walk of a park from anywhere in the city. We became the first city on the East Coast to be that city. Seattle beat us by a nose on the West Coast. But it's making major investments in tree canopies and other things, but all of that as well. I mean, when you think about environmental justice, it's also access to good open space. It's about all of those different things that mean so much to people. So it's not just about building a building to reduce carbon emissions. It's about really quality of life in the neighborhoods. And if you look at a map where we made the investments, we made it in a lot of areas that hadn't had that opportunity to have that open space in. So there is things that city governments can do, and there's things that local governments can do without waiting for direction from the federal government or waiting for direction. We should and can do that now.
Great points. Let me just bring in one more question from a student. Kate Paulino has one.
I am sorry, I lost you for a minute there. Thank you for all you're doing and for joining us tonight. I wonder if you might tell us about public-private partnerships in addressing the risk of sea level change and flooding.
Thank you, Kate. That's a great question and a timely question, because tomorrow morning I have a meeting with the Green Ribbon Commission, which is a commission of folks that are public sector, private sector, universities, some of our largest building owners in the city of Boston, and really thinking about, this commission's been together, I think, for about 9 or 10 years now. I'm co-chair of it, along with a gentleman by the name of Amos Hostetler from the Bar Foundation. And, we have these meetings about reducing carbon emissions. And in these meetings, I mean, it's going to take investment from the private sector. So let me just go back to Martin's Park and the 4-Point Channel. Martin's Park is an investment that we made, the city made, public dollars and some private dollars. And it's in the 4-Point Channel. And what we're concerned about, the 4-Point Channel is a flood zone that when it floods, and Moakley Park floods, anyone who's familiar with Boston, let me think how I explain this to you. Anyone's familiar with Boston, it's the South Boston waterfront, and it's the 4-Point Channel where the post office is, into Chinatown. Right now on the 4-Point Channel, we have 3 developments that are under consideration for the city of Boston, of which the developers are going to include their own climate resilience, climate money in there to build basically this connecting walkway. What this walkway is going to do is bring people back to the ocean and back to the harbor, but it's also going to create a space that as sea level rises, the tide's not going to come in, and we're going to prevent from the major flooding from happening. That's investments. Now, we're not twisting arms. These developers have offered to do it on their own. And I think in most cases, we're going to see on major development, we're going to see the private sector really making some big time investments. We also have trustees. We have what's called the trustees of the reservation. And we have other trustees here in the city that are making their own investments and creating. Over in East Boston, when you land in Logan Airport, there's a park there called Piers Park 1, Piers Park 2, Piers Park 3. That's also an investment made by philanthropic community, the philanthropic community. So it is, when you think about, and I have not put a price with the 47-mile park that we're building in the city, but I'm assuming it's in the billions of dollars, and not single billions of dollars, in the double billions of dollars, maybe even higher. Nobody can expect the municipality to pay for that type of investment. What we have to do is really create public-private partnerships. And it's about having those conversations to incorporate these businesses into it so they understand the impacts of climate change and sea level rise are real. And in Boston, thank God, to this point, we haven't really had to explain to people the importance of making these investments. And I think that is key to anything that we do in this country, particularly in Boston.
Thank you.
Great. I want to bring in some questions now from the Q&A. And so I've got a question here from Kelly Raymond, who is an undergraduate here at Brown University. And she asks you, Mr. Mayor, how has Boston continued to pursue climate action in light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that the first easiest part of that question is that we have put part of, I think, 10% of our capital budget to climate programming and climate action plans, and not just plans, but in carrying out that effort. We just passed, well, we didn't just pass the budget, but a budget passed in June. Our work can't stop. Sea level rise isn't gonna just all of a sudden not happen because of the climate. We're not gonna reduce carbon emissions by doing nothing. So we just operate every day as if we continue on forward. COVID has obviously on the health inequities, and I think Gabby asked a question earlier about, she didn't necessarily ask about racism, but she talked about inequities, inequality with communities of color. What COVID has put a big spotlight on here is the health inequities, the housing inequities, but also the environmental inequities. Now, it might not roll off the tip of people's tongue every day, but certainly we have not stopped our work because of the pandemic.
Great. I've got a question here from Professor Timmons Roberts, who points out that some adaptation efforts risk increasing emissions of greenhouse gases. And so does Boston have efforts to combine those two goals?
I'm going to let Chris take that one.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so especially when you look at embedded carbon, so the idea that construction itself and that activity is a carbon intensive. That is something that we're going to have to look forward to as we marry our climate ready plans, which are our adaptation plans, with our climate action plans, which are our mitigation plans. What I will say, though, generally, the mayor's product of Resilient Boston Harbor favors nature-based solutions. And so that is has a net positive carbon impact in general. So as you start to look at green space for adaptation, as you start to look at area of making more space for tidal wetlands, the ability to have a carbon sink, the ability to have not only protection against sea level rise, but also stormwater management systems, we think that is far less carbon intensive than something like a traditional giant seawall, which would be a large concrete structure that actually blocks people from the waterfront. So from an ecological and from a carbon standpoint, that's why we're supportive of nature-based solutions.
I also think, though, just on the construction side of it, I think that, Mayor Garcetti is a big proponent and big advocate of electrified public transit. And I think that we have to start thinking about in our construction delivery, how do we change that? You can't, as the professor, I think, your concern is a valid one as we think about building these greener buildings. And we're doing one right now in Boston. Boston University is doing one. We have diesel trucks on the site. So we have to think about how do we, over time, to reduce the emissions. Is not just about building a green building. It's also about reducing pollution from the different vehicles. So I think that, there are definitely some people out there looking at, we're doing studies on autonomous vehicles right now, which is nothing new construction, but we think about these different things that we can be laying in place. So, I think it's important that we speed that work up, by the way, and not wait for it to, we have to create an industry. We can't wait for the industry to be created.
Great. That actually feeds in nicely to the next question from Sharon Gold, who asks, anti-vehicle idling legislation is a low-hanging fruit that can significantly reduce carbon emissions and save money for your city. Would you consider?
I think we already have some of that in the city. We have an idling. You can only keep your car idling, I believe, bus or trucks for 5 minutes. In the city of Boston, it was passed before I became the mayor of Boston. We saw asthma rates in communities of color in Roxbury and other places that were going to the roof. They still are. And I know that the city at the time made some adjustments through different ordinances. Right now, our school buses, we have about 900 school buses in the city, and they cannot be running for any longer than by idling no longer than 5 minutes. So we have those policies in place right now. I don't believe it's statewide yet here in the Commonwealth, but certainly in the city, we have some of those policies.
Great. Paul Kotis asks, will Boston seek to implement a carbon tax or other means to encourage a switch away from the combustion of fossil fuels? Maybe this is keeping with our transportation theme, but you can also think more broadly about electrical systems as well.
We haven't gone there yet. I know that Chris's office has been reviewing different things along with our CFO. We have not made that decision to go there yet in Boston. Not really sure what the future of that is right now in the city, but we have not gone there right now.
Okay. So Jordan asks, so what does being the leader of the Climate Mayors Group actually mean? What is your role now exactly?
It means the salary that I get is so big that I'm very excited about all the additional work. There's no salary, by the way. What it means really, it's obviously it's difficult. In a way, there's an advantage to the times that we're in because of Zoom, but generally what it means is that we will host the U.S. Conference of Mayors has 3 meetings a year, and 2 of our meetings, there's an opportunity for bring us together. We spend a lot of time talking about sharing best practices. Not every city in the country has the means like Boston or New York or LA or even maybe Providence. Sometimes there's a lot less. They have a lot less ability. Their environment departments might be one person, might be a volunteer. So it's about helping cities and towns across America share best practices. It's also about taking each other's plans and seeing in the areas that there's coastline. How do we help these smaller towns that have coastline? Can we help them with the plan that we put together? areas like LA that has, civic concern about fires, and how do we help some of the smaller towns in the pathways of those areas. So, it really is about sharing ideas and best practices. And this organization has not worked under administration in Washington that has been pro science. We've only worked with an administration. I said this in the paper today, that, in my time, I got elected in 2014. So from 2014 to the end of President Obama's term, we spent lots of time in Washington talking about climate resiliency. Gina McCarthy, the former EPA secretary, commissioner, was from Boston. So we have her here. And I think that, it's going to be about putting meetings together so we continue to take the issue of climate resiliency seriously and offer supports for the other cities and towns across America. That's really basically one of the things we do, and can convene a lot of meetings, and also tie it into, what I think is really amazing is that, and the folks that are in the meeting tonight know this better than I do, there are some countries around the world that are so much further ahead in their countries than we are in the United States of America, and making those connections and making those plans is something that we have to do. So Climate Mayors we're trying to get caught up, quite honestly, than what's happened around the world. I was in Copenhagen a few years ago. It's amazing what's going on in Copenhagen with the infrastructure, with the bike infrastructure, with everything that they're doing. They made an announcement they wanted to be carbon neutral, I think, by 2025. They made an announcement at the conference a year and a half ago. Our 2050 goals there today. I'm not going to make an announcement that we want to cut it short, but in the real attacking this issue is probably going to have to be, we're going to have to be more intensive with it. So Climate Mayors I'll be guiding mayors that way.
Can I just follow up on that? I also spent some time in Copenhagen and very much echo your perspective on importing some of the lessons from leaders around the world. But I want to come back to this issue of the federal government, and with Joe Biden taking the presidency, what would be kind of one thing that he could do that would make the life of mayors around the country a little bit easier to act on climate change? What would you hope for from him?
A long-term plan. At the bottom line, we can talk about investments, we can talk about jobs. We need a plan, and we don't have a plan right now. And I think that when I think about, just the mayors that I know, friends of mine, Mitch Landrieu, I got to know Mitch Landrieu, and we talked about Katrina, and we talked about the economic impacts of Katrina on New Orleans, and really the impacts of it. I was talking to Eric Garcetti earlier this year during the presidential campaign. In his home, he was smelling the fires, and he was talking about the air quality and what was happening there. Mayor Turner in Houston, I called Mayor Turner in Houston right after the hurricane, and he couldn't believe that what was going on in his city. I went to Caguas, Puerto Rico after the hurricane in Puerto Rico, and when you think about, they got wiped out completely, and the infrastructure wasn't there. And I think that we need a plan, and it goes back to my earlier point. Eventually we need to make investments. That $1 billion saving $19 billion. That, just think about that for a minute. If the federal government made more investments, eventually, I'm not asking for the money right now, but for every dollar the federal government invests, they save $19 on the dollar. So when you think about $1 billion investment saving $19 billion down the road, just think about what a $100 billion investment in climate resiliency could mean for this country. Just for 1 second, think about that. The impact that could have, and the money that we save on the back end. It's dramatic.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask one more question from our list here. Glennie LeBaron says, thank you for speaking with us. I'm from Weston, Massachusetts, and I'm curious if you are thinking about how climate change will disproportionately affect lower income families, and how you may be integrating climate change resilience with solving social/economic disparities faced by citizens of Boston. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but taking a slightly different angle on it.
Yeah, no. First and foremost, I did talk about it, but it's at the forefront of our conversation here because the community is hardest hit. When Chris talked about, I think it was on the screen, he talked about us creating the chief of equity in the city of Boston. That was in response to the systemic issues that we have in this country and in the city, not the country, in the city. Racism, climate, housing, policing, all of those different pieces. And when I think about, when we talk about climate in the city, we talk about it from the table of cabinet. And when Chris is the chief of the environment, we talk cross sectors about what the impacts are on people. So it has to be at the forefront of the conversation. It has to be one of the first things that we talk about. Maybe reducing carbon emissions, it might be the first thing that comes out of my mouth, but then I have to talk about the impacts it has on disproportionate communities, particularly poorer communities of color. That when we think about our plans. I don't know if Chris, you want to add anything to that one.
No, Mayor, I think that's absolutely right. It's that idea of prioritization and working cross cabinet. Just a concrete example of that has been the mayor's supportive of moving Boston towards a carbon emissions standard, which will lower the carbon emissions of our largest buildings. Part of the reason and part of the work is he has linked us up with the Economic Development Cabinet and the Office of Workforce Development to make sure that we're prioritizing job opportunities for some of our most socially vulnerable populations. So if we're going to have a standard that decarbonizes large buildings, how do we make sure our kids are getting trained in these jobs, which are going to be the jobs of the future for the next 10, 20 years?
One thing that wasn't asked, and I just want everyone to understand this, and many of you know this from your studies at school, the coronavirus has done a couple things that we might look back on and we're going to benefit from. And one of the things in the city government that it's helping us with is cross collaboration and really understanding each other's departments and really working to help each other out, where instead of working in silos in the past, no, I'm not saying we're fully siloed, but we were siloed in different areas. Chris worried about the environment. Brian Golden worried about the planning department. Jerome Smith worried about neighborhood services. The commissioner worried about police, and everyone worried about their thing. With coronavirus, we meet now twice a week on a Zoom call. It's called the Crisis Response Forum. And it initially started out by responding to the COVID crisis, but what it's turned into is a working meeting where there's about 120 people from the city on there talking about the different issues that are in front of us. And climate is one of the ongoing conversations that we have in that crisis response forum that we don't talk about every single meeting, but we talk about different topics. And it's really magnified, intensified the conversation around the climate, which has been great.
Let me ask just an additional question we're getting in here about the fact that, for some industries, as much as I think that the overall benefits that you point out are exactly right for making climate investments, for some industries, this is going to raise their costs, right? There's no getting around that. And so, for instance, flood risks for certain property developers require extra investments, or changing standards for the energy costs of heating and cooling buildings. And so the question here is that I'm getting in is how do you deal with resistant industries in climate efforts? How do you work with them?
Well, I had one of those meetings the other day, and what I thought was kind of interesting was they all had resiliency experts in their company dealing with the impacts, but they were pushing back on some of the standard guidelines that we want to change. And, at the end of the day, their partnership is important to us. And at the end of the day, if we truly want to address the impacts of climate, it affects everyone. It affects the people working in the buildings. It affects the owners of the buildings. And I think that as we think down the road, I mean, some of the programs, they might be expensive to retrofit a building, but the long-term savings, long-term, will be better for them. And it's, there's two ways of doing it. One is collaborating and trying to get people to yes, or second is just putting in regulations and restrictions and enforcing it. I prefer the first part of that right now. And I think that, we are spending lots of time. I literally spent the other day, Chris was on the call. We spent about an hour and a half with some of the big, some developers, I guess, in the room. And we explained to them the importance of retrofitting their existing buildings. We explained what we can achieve and the benefits for them. And I think that we just need to continue to have conversations. It's just like the folks that are what they call them, climate deniers. People that the climate change isn't real. It is real. I mean, just my time as mayor, and before that, I mean, we used to have 4 seasons here in Boston. We don't have 4 seasons anymore. In 2015, we set a record for the amount of snow in one year. 106.4 inches of snow. The very next year, I think we had something like 50 inches of snow. Last year, I think we almost set a record for not having almost any snow. So there is definitely something happening here. And the building owners and that's where the public-private partners, Kate asked the question, that's where the public-private partnerships come into play, because we need building owners that understand the importance of doing this work, talking to their colleagues to explain to them the importance of doing this work.
Well, it's so helpful. And, we'll come back to where you started, which is that this is the challenge of our times, right? That climate change is here with us. In a certain way, COVID-19 has overshadowed the fact that the wildfires that we saw on the West Coast this year are kind of a taste, unfortunately, of what we might be seeing in the next few years and decades to come, unfortunately.
But the people that are concerned on this call about the last 3 years in the country, just think about this for a minute. 3.5 years ago, we were in the Paris Climate Accord. I was one of the mayors there, Eric Garcetti, and a handful of mayors from America. Donald Trump gets elected president, doesn't believe in science. 450 plus, I had the wrong number in the beginning, 450 plus cities in America created something called climate mayors. 450 cities in America for the last 3.5 years have been working on the issue of climate resiliency and climate change. There's a network now in this country that didn't exist pre-Donald Trump that can help the next administration, the Biden-Harris administration, move forward. So it's not just people talking down to governors and hopefully gets down to the cities and towns. There's a direct connection now between the White House, the Oval Office, in 450 cities and towns across America. That line is a very short line. And that infrastructure over the last 3 years, even though we feel that in the national level, a lot hasn't been done on it, the infrastructure is built out today. And I think that the Biden-Harris administration will be better for it, because now they have partners, true partners, that truly believe in the work that we're doing.
Well, that's terrific. I'm mindful of the time. We're just about up, but I just want to echo the point you made there, that one of the things we emphasized in the report that the Climate Solutions Lab issued was that in terms of dealing with climate change, there's no silver bullet, but there are a whole lot of tools across a whole lot of different agencies and departments that governments at the federal level and at the city level and at the state level can use to work on this. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the work that you're doing and for being with us here today.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me. And to all the students, thank you very much for all your work. Keep pushing.